It's my pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker, Dr. Sharon Lockyer. Dr. Lockyer is a reader in sociology and communications at Brunel University, London, and the founding director of the Center for Comedy Studies Research, which is the first international and interdisciplinary research center devoted to the academic study of comedy. Her work sits at the intersection of the sociology of pop culture, media and communications, and humor in comedy studies. Her research examines how humor and comedy reflect and shape social meanings and power dynamics, particularly in relation to gender, sexuality, class, and disability. She has written extensively on the ethics and aesthetics of live and mediated comedy, and her work has been foundational in the development of critical comedy studies, including the influential book Beyond a Joke: The Limits of Humor, co-edited with Michael Pickering. Dr. Lockyer's research has been supported by organizations including the British Academy, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and Arts Council England, and she has collaborated with a wide range of community, industry, and cultural partners. She is a member of the advisory panel for the Live Comedy Association, a membership organization dedicated to representing, supporting, and advocating for the UK live comedy industry. In addition to her research, she serves on the editorial boards of several leading journals in humor studies and is the founding co-editor of the Palgrave Studies and Comedy book series. She has also served as the president for the International Society for Humor Studies. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sharon Lockyer.
Thank you, Shelby, for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And hi, everyone. Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending where you are, because I know we're a global audience. Thanks for coming along to my presentation. I'd like to start by saying a huge thank you to Sal for inviting me to be a keynote speaker and the opportunity to present at this fantastic conference. I think Sal and the team have put together the most spectacular conference, and it's an honour to be part of it. So thank you very much. What I'd like to do today in the time that I've got is to consider and reflect on some of the interesting developments in stand-up comedy in relation to disability. As we know, in relation to stand-up comedy, topics that stand-up comedians joke about and the manner in which they joke about them and the tone that they take in relation to joking about those topics can provide interesting insights into how topics are understood, how they're negotiated, and how they're resisted at individual and societal levels. And that's an autobiographical mode of performance that's really closely linked to identity. Stand-up comedy and comedians, stand-up comedy allows comedians to comedically discuss, to question and to critique disability and ableism, and also sort of reflect on relationships between disabled and non-disabled people. So in the presentation today, I'm going to examine how contemporary stand-up comedians, such as Samuel J. Conroe, who's on the screen on the first slide of the PowerPoint, but also Benny Feldman, construct and reconstruct, or deconstruct and reconstruct multiple understandings of disability via mainstream comedy in order to reflect on the contribution that stand-up comedy can make to 21st century understandings around disability. So to do so, I'd like to sort of extend my existing research really and draw on a theme that runs throughout my research that focuses on stand-up comedy and issues around social inequality and cultural exclusion. And that can be representation, it might be production, but also participation. And how these shifts around social inequality and social cultural exclusion, sort of relates to shifting socio-political and cultural contexts. So in addition to focusing my research on representation of disability in TV comedy, a number of projects that I've been involved in over the last probably now 15 years or so focuses on the socio-political roles of contemporary stand-up comedy in relation to disability, primarily in the British context. I've worked with organisations such as Abnormally Funny People and Bright Sparks and their Comedy Asylum, thinking about and unpacking this really complex and knotty relationship between comedy and disability. But today I'd like to take my existing research on comedy and disability, take it into a new area, or sort of a new road, if you like, or avenue. Because to date, my research on comedy and disability is focused on either disabled comedians with physical disabilities or comedians with mental health conditions. Whereas what I'd like to do today is start to think about how can we make sense of what disabled comedians or comedians with Tourette syndrome are doing through their performances. But before we focus on Tourette syndrome and stand-up comedy in more detail, I think what's quite useful for us to do is just remind ourselves of that important relationship between stand-up comedy and identity. So as I've mentioned, the stand-up comedy and identity are closely interconnected. And I think this is really illustrated when we think about the particular features of stand-up comedy. So Oliver Double, who's a key writer and scholar in stand-up comedy theory, has argued that there are three defining features of stand-up comedy. In addition to being funny, obviously it has to be funny, but also stand-up comedy is characterized by personality, by direct communication, and also by present tense. But it's really personality in Double's work that highlights the importance of identity. A stand-up comedy, he argues, quote, puts a person on display in front of an audience, whether that person is an exaggerated comic character or a version of the performer's own self. And we see identity being central to the roles that fulfilled by stand-up comedy. And if we think about the work of Lawrence Mintz, where he argues that the oldest and most basic role of stand-up comedians is to be a negative exemplar, where negative exemplars centre on identity as they enact character traits, which might be physical, it might be emotional traits, it might be psychological, it could be political, it could be social, cultural. But those traits are crucially, they're socially unacceptable and are enacted by the comedian to be ridiculed, to be laughed at, to be repudiated and symbolically punished. So there's a real clear sense in the way in which Mintz argues that identity is centre and so pivotal to stand-up comedy. And this draws attention really to how comedians may speak on behalf of individuals or groups or societies, for example, to articulate how they might be being treated unfairly or unequally, the way in which they may have experienced discrimination or oppression, but crucially, how they could critique and resist dominant stereotypical representations. And more recently, Pickett has observed that comedy's power as a performative medium is exactly built around this exploration of boundaries of identity. And identity markers and characteristics and how those might shift and change over time according to context and according to a particular context and moment that we're referring to at any one time. And in Joanne Gilbert's work, where she's looked at performing marginality through stand-up comedy by women comedians, Gilbert argues that stand-up comedy is this autobiographical type of performance that's unique in its simultaneous construction of personal identity on the one hand, but doesn't just necessarily focus on that. That can allow us then to think about how comedians might offer cultural critique or social critique through the lens of their personal identity. And this really aligns with Beck Crefton's work around charged humour, where Crefton argues that comedians can intentionally produce humour that challenges social inequality and cultural exclusion. And more recently, scholars such as Mali and her colleagues have argued that comedy, particularly stand-up comedy, can be framed as quite a significant instrument for social critique and cultural reflection. And I suppose this is why I'm particularly interested in stand-up comedy. So if we sort of set the scene in terms of thinking about the importance of stand-up comedy and identity, how does that look, or how does all of this relate to disability? So I just want to spend a few moments thinking about how comedy has been related to disability, or how disability has been related to comedy across history. And much of the historical ways in which disability has been represented in comedy, generally speaking, has involved disabling humour, where disability is comedically constructed as something that's quite negative. It's been constructed in a derogatory manner. It's been something to be laughed at and to be ridiculed. And it's largely consisted of non-disabled people laughing at disabled people. So, for example, non-disabled people laughing at disabled people across history is evident as individuals who were used as court jesters, for example. They were used as exhibits of curiosity in freak shows, for example, the image on the screen now, or as cartoon characters they may have speech or sight impairments. So there's a long trajectory of this relationship between comedy and disability, laughing at disabled people. And a key piece of research that I often go to that I find really useful is Haller and Ralph's analysis of how the relationship between comedy and disability has changed over time across the 20th century. And they argue that the relationship between comedy and disability has passed through 4 different phases. And the first phase is where disabled people were constructed by freak shows and, quote, used mentally disabled people as representative fools. So that was the first phase. And then they argue the second phase changed slightly, but still laughing at disabled people, where comedy and jokes made fun of people with disabilities, but emphasized their limitations. This was still non-disabled people making jokes about disabled people. And it wasn't until their third phase where we see people with disabilities or disabled people taking control of the comic message. So having ownership of the comedy rather than being the target, taking some sort of control over it. And then it's really this fourth phase where comedy about disability focuses on how disability is just a normal and expected part of human existence, and where comedy tries to or highlights the importance of equality. It's based on honesty, authenticity in performance, particularly disabled comedians performing. And I think it's these 2 phases 3 and 4, that offer possibilities for comedy to challenge social barriers and negative attitudes and stereotypes and discrimination around disability, to shift the emphasis, if you like, or to shift the dial away from disability. It's being stereotypical, based on discrimination and inequity or inequality, and shifting that towards something that's more positive and more accurate reflections of disabled people's lived experience. And in my previous research on comedy and disability, I've observed how some disabled comedians are creatively shifting the comedy spotlight from being the targets of comedy, so phases 1 and 2, to disabled people becoming comedy makers, in order to challenge disabled stereotypes and restrictive cultural representations and expectations of disabled people. And it's really the increased prominence and prevalence of disabled people on the live comedy circuit, which I think is driving that and might accelerate the transformative potentials of stand-up comedy. And I think it's really useful to draw on the work of Reed and colleagues who've written about stand-up comedy in America performed by disabled people. And they draw on the cultural theorist Stuart Hall's work, where they argue that disability is not an empirical fact, but a floating signifier. So, and they argue, quote, it's a cultural and historical artifact continually shifting in meaning. And if it shifts in meaning across time, space, or context, it offers the possibility that comedy can be used as a tool in the quest for social and political change and social justice surrounding disability by shifting the meaning around disability. And as I said, the live comedy circuit has changed quite I don't want to say dramatically because that's a bit of exaggeration, but it's changed with more disabled comedians performing. So, for example, my research looked at Lost Voice Guy, Tanya Lee Davis, Lawrence Clark, Rosie Jones, for example. These are all comedians who are disabled. There are others, for example, Steady Eddie in Australia, or Josh Blue, or American Comedians and Disabilities Act, for example. So this is a widespread sort of shift and change over time. And as my colleague Simon Weaver and I have argued, the recent shifts in stand-up comedy have included marginalised identities gaining prominence in stand-up comedy, where there's an increased awareness of the complexities of identity politics. And Bennett refers to these shifts as, quote, a millennial comic vernacular, where stand-up comedy comments on oppression and non-dominant experiences. And Bennett goes on to argue that there's a millennial era of resistive stand-up comedy that celebrates the non-dominant perspective. And I think that's what really I'm really interested in and passionate about, particularly if they couple that with the social model of disability, which views that people are disabled by societal barriers, whether those are physical, organisational, attitudinal, rather than their impairments or the condition or their conditions. So I've sort of mapped out the relationship between comedy and identity, and now I think I've sort of mapped out very briefly comedy and disability. And I want to focus more specifically on Tourette syndrome and what we know about Tourette syndrome and what we know about that in relation to comedy. So Tourette syndrome, as I'm sure you know, is a neurological condition with often onset during childhood, and it's characterized by tics. Those are involuntary, unwanted movements or vocalizations that can vary in frequency, complexity, and intensity. And that's how the American Psychiatric Association understands and defines Tourette syndrome. And the condition's been portrayed as, and I put this in speech marks, the swearing disease within mainstream media, according to Calder, Sprackman and colleagues, and also Fatt and colleagues, by virtue of the symptom of corporalia, which is involuntary utterances of obscene words or taboo words or swear words or offensive words. Although the feature of Tourette syndrome, well, this feature of Tourette syndrome was fairly uncommon, if we find in the literature. And our understanding of Tourette syndrome is often understood through the medical model of disability, which is different model to social model of disability. So the medical model views tics as deficiencies and as problems that need to be cured, so that those with tics can function normally. And hopefully you can see that I'm doing all of that in speech marks. Hopefully you can see that. And it frames the individual as the problem, and makes society basically unaccountable for social exclusion, for stereotypes and discrimination. Now, when I've been looking for literature on Tourette syndrome and comedy, I think it's probably suffice to say there's not that much out there. It's a small body of literature, but this literature that I have found is really interesting and really revealing. And Marley and Forrester Jones conducted a survey, an interview study to explore the experiences of stigma in adults living with Tourette syndrome in the UK. And they found that there was an impact of disparagement humour in the construction and promotion of othering of individuals with Tourette syndrome. And they found that the majority of their research participants who had Tourette syndrome suggested that jokes were used to demean or to dismiss their experiences. And they observed that jokes did not merely cement stereotypes in the public's mind, but also actively contributed to stigmatization and construction of otherness. There's a trivialization of Tourette syndrome through jokes and media representations. And it is a complex and controversial topic. So I just wanted to share with you, I don't know if you might have been familiar with this example, but the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2019, they always have a Dave's Funniest Joke of the Fringe award. And in 2019, Olaf Falafel, a stand-up comedian, won that prize, won the award for the joke that was based around Tourette's. His joke was, "I keep randomly shouting out broccoli and cauliflower. I think I might have Tourette's." Okay, and the Tourette's Action, which is a Tourette's syndrome charity, asked for an apology as it felt the joke reinforced stereotypical views. But that charity then received hundreds of messages accusing the charity of being humorous, lacking a sense of humor, and failing to take a joke. And there's more on that in terms of controversies around Tourette syndrome towards the end. And some of you might have been following the news the last couple of weeks will probably know what I'm referring to. But a couple of findings in Malley and Forrester Jones's research that really struck a chord with me and really encouraged me to think about this in more detail. So their research found that people with Tourette's are considered a politically and ethically more acceptable target than people with physical or even mental disabilities. And in many cases, Tourette's jokes have become a moral amnesty. It's become almost like the norm and accepted, and you sort of get away with it, even if a charity complains about it. But more interesting, this is what really struck with me in relation to sort of building on what they're arguing. They quote that despite our findings, humour in relation to Tourette syndrome is surprisingly understudied, and findings illustrate the need to theorise what makes us laugh in relation to Tourette syndrome. Why is it still considered fair play, and to explore its consequences and functions? Furthermore, we need to examine the role of Tourette's humour in reproduction and circulation of stereotypes. And so I use these quotes and these findings as a springboard for what I'm interested in my current research. That was also coupled with this next slide. I mean, this is based on one of their interviewee participants who suggested, rather than it being something we try to quash, and they're referring to jokes about Tourette syndrome, which we won't be able to, it's something that the Tourette's community could use much more to get out there and to give support out to people with Tourette syndrome. So this is where I'm picking up their sort of conclusions or their suggestions and thinking about what's happening on the circuit or in live comedy or recorded live comedy in relation to Tourette syndrome, comedians with Tourette syndrome. So I've been looking at and exploring comedians with Tourette syndrome, and they're, relatively speaking, there are not that many like I could find. And this is the slide that you can see now is just a few examples of comedians that I found. There are others. These are just a few that I wanted to share with you to give you an idea of who I'm interested in. So the person with the black skirt and the black jacket and top is Pamela Schuller. She describes herself as, quote, "What happens when you mix stand-up comedy with a master's degree in advocacy and just the right amount of neurological chaos?" And she's a stand-up comedian, storyteller, and an internationally known advocate who talks about inclusion. Then the person in the centre with the green T-shirt on and microphone is Benny Feldman, a stand-up comedian based in New York City. And he describes himself, or his website describes himself as, quote, a stand-up comedian known for his one-liners about butterflies, frogs, and such, and for performing with Tourette syndrome. He's won a number of awards as well. And then the person with the pink shirt and the microphone and the tattoos is Samuel J. Comrose, American stand-up comedian who performs quite a lot of shows every year. And some of you might be familiar with him as a contestant on the 13th season of American's Got Talent, that Lucy Defined talent show. And he came in fourth place. He's also winner of Ricky Gervais's comedy competition. And Sam jokes about trials and tribulations of living with Tourette syndrome. He was diagnosed when he was 6, and also observational material about his life experiences of having Tourette's. And then finally, we have Jess Tom, a British theatre maker and comedian who established a alter ego called Tourette's Hero. So that's the person you can see in the superhero outfit. And this project aimed at illustrating or raising awareness of Tourette syndrome, which then toured across the globe. It's really hard, I found, to find clips of stand-up comedy. There's quite a lot of clips of theatre performances, particularly Jess's performances. But I have found a limited number of stand-up comedy that I'd like to share with you and talk about today. One's from, well, a couple of clips from Samuel Comroe, and also one from Benny Feldman. I do appreciate that is, they're both male comedians, they're both white comedians, they're both, obviously they have Tourette's, obviously that's one of the important features. So we might I need to think about intersectionality and trying to think about broaden out the examples. But these are the ones we're going to go with and run with today. So I've got a couple of clips that I'd like to share with you if the technology allows me to. The first one I'd like to show is of Samuel Comroe's audition on American's Got Talent. And I think this is a really interesting example because he's obviously trying to set the scene. It's in audition, the first time that he's probably gone on live TV, or on TV, I should say, and sort of setting the scene in terms of who he is and what he jokes about. So I'm just going to hopefully share this with you. Okay, so this is Samuel Comroe. What I'm going to do now, I'll just go straight to the next clip, I think, which is by another comedian, Benny Feldman, who also has Tourette's. I just want to play maybe the first minute or so of this performance, just to give you a flavour of how different comedians who've got Tourette syndrome perform. So this is Benny Feldman. So they're both comedians, obviously, with Tourette syndrome. Both were ticking during the performance. Both had interesting things to share about their experiences. Obviously, Samuel Comroe talking about Tourette's camp. And I think there's some interesting things about how Tourette's can be seen as spectacle in relation to he was arguing about or referring to 100 kids with Tourette syndrome all being together and all ticking together. And with the parents observing as onlookers, so it's very much laughing sort of at people with Tourette syndrome, and maybe thinking back to Lawrence Mintz's ideas and negative exemplar, these character traits, these physical tics that are being the basis of humour and basis of the laughter. There's also a sense of how Comroe is suggesting there's a darker side to Tourette's in terms of thinking about suggesting that he may have killed his neighbour. And I think this links in quite nicely with the suggestion that Benny Feldman makes about anybody could say or do a tic and say they've got Tourette syndrome, which if we think about some of the literature around disability and this idea of disabled people faking it or putting it on, there's a sort of reflection or a link that can be made in relation to what Benny Feldman's saying, suggesting that people who tic may be putting it on or doing it for effect. And this links really closely to previous research that I've published on comedy and disability, where comedians with, whether it might be physical disabilities, are often charged with putting it on or faking it after a show, to saying that they're putting it on just to get a laugh or just to be funny or to not necessarily be authentic or credible in their performances. So it's essentially suggesting that Tourette's is something that ultimately is something to be laughed at rather than laughed with. And this sort of counters Marley and Forrester Jones's observations, where they suggest that people with Tourette's and comedy around Tourette's, they're not necessarily depicted as demonic, violent, or dangerous. And there's an element that here we could suggest that there's the fakery and this sort of suggestion that they may have committed a crime or a murder, but also sort of playing with that idea at the same time. But what I think is really interesting is other examples of Samuel Conroe when he is not performing his scripted comedy. I think it's when it goes off script, some really interesting things take place. And I'd like to show you a performance where Conroe is interacting with a member of the audience who has Tourette syndrome and tics during his show, because I think this reveals something that's much more open to critique, socially providing a social critique and a sort of a movement towards challenging stereotypes around Tourette syndrome. So again, if the technology allows, I will play this longer clip, but I'd like to play all of it because I think it really shows some really interesting things going on. So let me do this. Okay, hopefully you've got mum puts muzzle on son. Thank you, perfect. So this is a bit longer, but I'd like to show all of it as I mentioned. So let's see what we think of this one.
You have Tourette's? Who has Tourette's? Yeah, I heard it earlier. Yeah, I can hear it. Is that your Tourette's? You go, oh yeah? Yeah, do you have more than that? No, that's a cool ass Tourette's. You just go, oh yeah, I have Tourette's too. You know, that's why you came. Yeah. A lot of people don't know. I gotta explain it. I have Tourette's too. It's why I blink real fast and my head flops around and all that shit. But you're blessed. That's a dope one. I got a fucked up one. You turn into the Kool-Aid guy. That shit is so dope. Oh yeah. Mama! Cuddles in our living room again. Oh yeah. I panicked, came up with the best answer I could think of. I said, look, baby girl, this is the real world. And sometimes, when girls... That was new. Sir, can you just not Tourette's during my fucking punchlines? That was so symbolic for how this show has been. That one moment really represented this entire show. Sometimes girls just skirt. Yeah, man, I hate it when girls always skirting all over the place. God damn it, bro, I can't take you anywhere. Can you hold it together for 2 minutes? If you got one, just punch the fucking dude next to you. Just release it through your body. Or fucking muffle it, you know what I mean? Yeah, use a napkin. Is that a barf bag? What did he just give you? Is that a muffler? Oh my God, put that away, I'm joking. Who is that guy next to you that just handed you that? Oh my God, it's a joke. I would never, don't put that in fucking, he's not a horse. This dude is a human. Jesus Christ, Kyle, put your muzzle on. You said skirt again at the wrong time, you piece of shit. You have a muzzle? That's crazy. It's a medical device. That's what they call it. That's not real. Don't believe that shit, dog. That's a washcloth with chloroform. Do not put that on your face. Skirt. You're gonna wake up in the car in 2 hours. That was a good show. That's so fucked up. If I was at a show because I got this twitch and my wife handed me a goddamn straitjacket, Samuel, put it on. You hitting the people next to you. Man, there is no way to finish this joke. I've been doing this for too long. Once you lose it, it is gone. And that fucking skirt took that shit into Wisconsin wind. Skirted the shit out of my joke. Sir, how about you put the fucking muzzle on? You be disabled for 2 minutes. What does that look like? What is it? Is that a real thing?
Yeah, it's actually.
I've never seen that in my life. That's crazy. What'd you say? Your mother gave it to him? You're the mom. Oh, you gave it to him. What is that? Bro, that looked like a knee brace. Is that one of those things when you're on house arrest? What is that?
No, it's just basically muffles your tics when to make them softer like this.
No, don't muffle that shit, bro. You brave for being here. I appreciate you being here. Everything up here is jokes, I promise you. Do not, I really appreciate you for coming out because I can't even imagine how hard this is going with the verbal tick. When I got this shit, it's very tough. And you got that. I can't imagine being in public, everybody's distracted and they're looking at you all the time. Don't fucking put that on. And that's gonna make it worse. You sound like you'd be kidnapped. Don't put that on. My God, that's crazy. Do you do that in public? You fucking wear it? Looking like Hannibal Lecter and shit? Yeah, don't do that anymore. Let it fly. Yeah, fuck that, man. Go to the movies and you just be you. Who gives a shit? I don't care what movie you see. Go during a horror movie. Someone gets stabbed. I want to hear you behind me. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, let me just go back to my PowerPoint. Let's do that. Hopefully you can see my slides coming through. Excellent. Okay, so I think in that example, there's loads that could be said. What starts off as quite a sort of a straightforward interruption of Samuel's joke by somebody in the audience, ticking skirt, and it's quite jovial, and it's not necessarily deep, it's not necessarily critical, then develops into a sort of critique and a subversion of social norms of trying to stop or camouflaging or muffling vocal tics, and then ends up ridiculing the social norm of suppression of tics in public life. And what we also see there is I think the idea of be you, sort of is this affirmation of disability. So to be your authentic self and not necessarily succumb to social norms or social stereotypes around what is acceptable behaviour. And I think what we also see here through that narrative as it changes and becomes much more sort of socially critical and offers a social critique is this type of humour that, as I mentioned earlier, Crafting refers to as charged humour, whereas challenges cultural exclusion through this idea of being you and being sort of trying to be accepted, although that probably would be a challenge, but to be sharing yourself, your whole self, and celebrating your whole self by being you. And that obviously links back, as I mentioned earlier, to the affirmation model of disability. And I think it's that moment where it's unscripted that we get that opportunity, or Sam gets that opportunity to really work with the person in the audience who also has Tourette's syndrome, and riff off that, but also be really quite clever and first and critical in that response, in that moment, which I think is a real celebration of Tourette's. And I think the laughter and the clapping comes at moments where there's a celebration of being your authentic self, and having tics and not succumbing to social norms around suppressing tics. I'm really conscious of time, so I'm just going to very briefly just link this back to some events that some of you might be familiar with, that's happened in, that was what we've just watched. I don't know if any of you have been following what's been happening in relation to Tourette's syndrome and some of the controversies more recently around people with Tourette's and the public debates around Tourette's. I won't go into this detail too much, but I Swear is a British it's a British biographical drama film that was released in 2025. It's based on the true life story of John Davidson, who you can see in the third image across here, who has Tourette's syndrome. And the film, should I say, biographical drama film, documents his life, documents the issues and the stereotypes and the discrimination and oppression that he experiences. And this received a lot. Well, it received 5 nominations at the BAFTAs, the British Academy Film and Television Arts Awards, and it won 3 of those. And this award ceremony took place February 20. When was it? February of this year, on the 22nd of February. And John Davison was present at the BAFTA award ceremony. And John Davison, as I mentioned, has tics, and he has vocal tics. And he ticked a racist slur while black actors Michael B. Jordan and Delroy Lindo were on stage. And then the BBC broadcast the BAFTA coverage. There's a 2-hour delay. They didn't edit out the racist slur. And this caused a lot of public debate and discussion about Tourette's syndrome and sort of the lack of understanding around Tourette's syndrome, but also coupled with the tensions around it being a racist slur, and it got quite a lot of media coverage. That then continued when comedian and actor Dean Cole hosted the National Association for Advancement of Coloured People's Image Awards on Saturday, the 28th of February, almost a week later, and referred to the incident with Davison at the BAFTAs. I made a joke about that. I won't repeat the joke for purpose of time. That then generated quite a lot of controversy. And then Saturday Night Live was critiqued last week for its sketch about Tourette's syndrome, where it depicted a series of controversial celebrities blaming their behaviour on the condition, which obviously is caused by involuntary verbal tics. And that sort of links back to Benny Feldman's idea that Tourette's is the abstract art of disabilities, that we can all pretend that we've got it. And I think there's some really interesting distinctions to be made between inclusion when it's in a film that's choreographed and links to specific expectations and norms in terms of narrative and storyline. But when tics are unscripted in TV programs like the BAFTAs, that's when it becomes an issue and it becomes problematic. But crucially, it's those unscripted tics in the live comedy arena that becomes crucial to the opportunity and possibility for comedy to be socially and culturally critical and challenge dominant norms and stereotypes. So for me, it's where the live circuit has a real potential role to play in shifting the dial on our understanding of Tourette syndrome from oppression, discrimination to inclusion. And I will finish there with purpose of time. So I hope I've given you a flavour of what I'm currently interested in relation to disability in comedy. Thank you.